Hi everyone. So before we discuss our topic, I just want to apologize for the loud barking in the background because my dog is going very nuts right now. Don't think I'm like she's fine. That's really all. Like she's fine. So our invasive species that we had to research was the European
starling.
The European starling. So before we get into what the European starling was about and its invasion, we're gonna talk before we discuss the European starling. We're gonna talk a little bit about the difference between a keystone and indicator species is what they are. So a keystone species, really any species in an ecosystem that all other species depend on, and this one keystone species really maintains the overall population of the ecosystem. And if you were to remove the keystone species, the whole ecosystem would dramatically feel the results of that, and change would be brought about due to the disappearance of the keystone species. So they kind of regulate the whole ecosystem, and without it, ecosystems would drastically be different. So an example of a keystone species, a great example are otters. They provide ecosystems with, plentiful of dams that, really in turn help the whole ecosystem and species that live in it. So they're considered a keystone species. But also, if you want to think of keystone species not necessarily in like an environmental light, you can kind of look at it in like a societal light, I guess, in a way. Like you could say like the keystone, I wouldn't know if it would be called the keystone species, but like a keystone of our school would be Mr. Arenas, because he's like the moderator of everything, and if you were to like remove him, I guess, havoc would occur. And even in like, I guess in a greater scale, you could think of a keystone as government, as the government in general, because they kind of hold everything together. And an indicator species is a species that can be used to infer conditions in a particular habitat, and indicator species are extremely valuable to not predict the future, but like kind of to predict the future. So like indicator species kind of give us like hints of to like what could possibly come next as a result of the indicator species. So I don't really know if that made sense, but you could use them as like a tool, to monitor and describe environmental change, because each indicator species is kind of representative of something that could like happen in the future. So they almost foreshadow like future events, kind of. And a great example of an indicator species are amphibians, specifically frogs though, but all amphibians in general. They can, depending on, I guess, where they are and in the conditions that they're in with like the amount of population they have, can infer specific events. So that's basically what an indicator species is. Now we're going to talk about invasive species and non-native species. So invasive species are any type of species with a large population or a fast reproduction rate that are introduced to an area and either carry disease with them or cause environmental or economic damage to the area. And non-native species are any type of species that have been found outside of their natural like range, or like where they typically would not be found. So the non-native species typically don't affect the survival of others within an ecosystem. So basically the difference between the two is that invasive species have negative effects on an ecosystem, while non-native species have a neutral or even positive effect to it. So in turn, both species are very similar. It's just the effect that they bring about, if that makes sense, because they're both new species being introduced to a different, I guess, region that they've never been in before. It's just, the impacts of their actions. Yeah. So next, Olivia's gonna talk about the defining characteristics of the European starling.
The European starling is a medium-sized black. The European starling is black, medium-sized, has triangular wings and a short tail. The plumage of the European starling is a glossy black with green, purple, and blue iridescence. In the fall, starlings may have a spotty appearance after molting. Starlings also have bright yellow beaks. They started invading North America in the 1890s when the Europeans came over. They're mainly known to be agricultural pests because they damage crops and berries. They aggressively compete with the native birds for the area, for the insects they eat.
The European starlings are agricultural pests, meaning that they brutally attack any crops or form of food like nuts and berries for food. But this poses a huge problem with the native species that they compete with, because since we all know that resources are limited, the starlings aggressively fought off and took their own food away from the native species birds, which kind of, dramatically affected the native species because their population was heavily on the decline, whether it was from being attacked by a starling or if they didn't have enough food.
Starlings are also known to enter buildings to roost and build nests, and they create sanitation problems because they can carry diseases that are transmissible to livestock and to people.
So basically I'm just going to recap what Olivia said. So yeah, in the 1890s, European starlings were introduced to North America from Europe, and the crimes they committed, I guess if you want to say, so as Olivia said, they are agricultural pests and they're very competitive for their food, which meant that they were almost fighting off the native species bird for their food. So you can see that these European starlings are literally just invading they were invading North America. They took all of the native foods, I guess, resources, their food, specifically berries, and they even destroyed crops.
And they really caused a lot of problems because of how fast they reproduce. And like I can say from my own experience, I see them all over the place, like in these big groups, just eating everything.
Humans should definitely be concerned about them because they can very easily carry disease, and even easier transmit their diseases if they carry them to livestock, to crops, or even humans. So humans should definitely watch out for them. And then also they kind of are home invaders. They can actually be found invading actual buildings, whether it's like homes or like office, whatever. And
for their space.
Yeah, for their space, because they're very dominant and aggressive and assertive, like I mentioned, especially with their food, but also when it comes to this. And this also poses just a sanitation problem for, I guess, the humans who, I guess, use that building for their benefit, which is kind of gross, honestly, because if you have like a diseased bird, like either in your house or your workspace, that's not very nice to know, because you can very easily, get that disease because these birds carry disease and because they can transmit it even easier.
A way to prevent them from breaking into different places is to provide like netting or like, those bird spikes. The bird spikes,
There are ways to prevent these birds from harming you or really affecting you, but I don't think it's too logical, to be completely honest. I mean, you could, yes, like Olivia said, you could put spikes around where
nettings in the
yeah, you can use nets and spikes to prevent the bird from coming near your house or on your property. But I mean, to actually be rid of the whole entire species, that would be really difficult, because you would have to find people to find the birds and their the bird's lair.
The lair. Their
No,
lair.
you would. It would be kind of hard to just kill a whole population. So if people were looking to do that, then I would suggest starting off for their offspring, or soon to be offspring in their egg form, I guess. So I mean, you could always try that if you get bored and you're just sick of them. You can go find their eggs and just dispose of them. Realistically, there is no great way of preventing these birds from
I got really dizzy.
being present in our town or wherever, but you could always use some sort of equipment to prevent them from affecting your own property, which would be using spikes or netting or any equipment that would protect you from the birds. But I mean, realistically, you're not gonna go kill out a whole population of birds. So I would just say suck it up and deal with them. So yeah, they just were huge competitors for the native species, and there wasn't really any specific native species to like combat these starlings. So basically they just invaded and just had complete authority and really do whatever they want, and there weren't really any they didn't have any regulations because no one was like,
no one thought that they would.
Yeah, and there was no other species that was trying to like,
no predators.
Yeah,
right?
they had no competition.
Thank you so much for watching, guys. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on that little bell so you know when I post. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.
Okay, get out of my house.